Please turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. It is in this chapter that we read of the denial and betrayal of Jesus. And there are many lessons that we can learn from the denial and the betrayal that I want us to examine this morning. In particular, looking at the example of Peter and that which led up to the denial and how that can be applied to our lives to make sure that we are not heading in a wrong direction like he was. It is my plan this afternoon then to look at his epistles, inspired of God, that address some of the very things that he did leading up to his denial of Jesus, and how we can learn from one who's been there and done that, so to speak. But this morning we'll look at the examples itself and that which led up to Peter denying the Lord. In Mark chapter 14, verse 27, beginning, the Bible tells us that the disciples had partaken of what we refer to as the Last Supper. They sang a hymn and went to the Mount of Olives. And here Jesus said, "All ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee." But Peter said unto him, "Although all shall be offended, yet will not I." And Jesus said unto him, "Verily I say unto thee, that this day, even in this night, before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice." But he spake the more vehemently, "Even I should die with thee, I will not deny thee in any wise." Likewise also said they all. And they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit ye here while I shall pray." And he taketh with him Peter and James and John, and began to be sore amazed, and to be very heavy. And said unto them, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch." And he went forward a little, and fell on the ground, and prayed that if it were possible the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt." And he came and findeth them sleeping, and said unto Peter, "Simon, sleepest thou? Couldest thou not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed and spake the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Neither knew they what to answer. And he came the third time and said, "Sleep on now, and take your rest. It is enough. The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise up, let us go. Lo, he that betrayeth me is at hand." And immediately while he yet spake, came Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests, and the scribes and the elders. And he that betrayed him had given him a token, saying, "Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Take him and lead him away safely." And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to Jesus, and said, "Master, Master," and kissed him. And they laid their hands on him, and took him. And one of them that stood by drew a sword, and smote a servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. And Jesus said unto them, "Are you come out as against a thief with swords and with staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not, but the scriptures must be fulfilled." And they all forsook him and fled. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young man laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. And they led Jesus away to the high priest. And with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. And Peter followed afar off, even to the palace of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, What need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, Prophesy. And thy servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. And as Peter was beneath in the palace, there came one of the maids of the high priest, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, And thou also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And a maid saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, This is one of them. He denied it again. And a little after they stood by, said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. But he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not this man of whom you speak. And the second time the cock crew, and Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said unto him, Before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And when he thought thereon, he wept. Peter is known for many things, historically speaking. One being his boisterous nature, his courage, if you will, his lack of insincerity, but his ability to speak, and sometimes to speak too soon. But we know Peter to be a strong-willed individual, a smart individual, a man who loved Jesus. And how is it that a man like that could deny Jesus 3 times? And so what we want to look at this morning is the things that led up to that denial. First, we see some arrogance in Peter. Arrogance is something that can lead individuals down a path they don't want to go. Proverbs 16 verse 18 tells us that pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. In Mark chapter 14 verses 27 through verse 31, Jesus tells his disciples, One of you tonight will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to Jesus, Though all of these individuals deny you, it won't be me. It won't be me. Now, I suppose there's not a one of us here today who would have said, Lord, it's me that will deny you. We would all agree to say we would never deny the Lord, right? And the reason it would be fair for us to all say today we're not going to deny Jesus is because we definitely don't want to do that. The problem comes when Jesus said, Peter, before the cock crow twice, you'll have denied me 3 times. And Peter said, no, it won't be me. Now, if Jesus had said that to us, we might want to think a little, right? We need to think before we speak when it comes to that. That should have been a very sobering moment for Peter. Jesus knew what was going to take place because he knew Peter, and Peter knew himself a little better than we even know him, right? There was something about Peter that he knew, and Jesus knew, that we don't necessarily know till we get to the end of this chapter anyway. And that was that even at this point in time, though he was outspoken for the Lord, that he loved the Lord, that his faith was not as strong as perhaps it should have been. And Peter was not alone here. Peter was not the only one who left Jesus alone, was it? The Bible tells us that the other disciples also fled. Their faith wasn't where it should be either. But it was Peter who spoke up and said, "It won't be me," right? It won't be me. This perhaps is the first step towards his denying of Jesus. Not believing that he could do something wrong that obviously any individual could do. Many people today refuse to think that they can do certain things when any individual could do them. It is our goal to prepare ourselves and to build ourselves and strengthen ourselves to the point where we can stand against temptation and to withstand temptation so as not to fall. But by merely boasting that I won't do it doesn't make it so, does it? By merely voicing something doesn't mean that that's how I'll stand when push comes to shove. It is the first step towards leading to this denial, and it's in direct opposition to what Jesus said in regards to those who would be in his kingdom in Matthew chapter 18, verse 3 and verse 4. You'll remember that there Jesus was told not to waste his time, but he didn't see it as a waste of time. In verse 2, he said, Jesus called a little child unto him and set him in the midst. In verse 3 it says, Jesus verily says, Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. What Peter needed at this time was a little humility. He needed to be more childlike than boisterous adult-like, didn't he? He needed to be more childlike, more humble. He should have accepted what Jesus said to him and thought about those things and the repercussions of those things. When an individual loses his humility, he takes the first step to denying Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12, Paul said, Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. Peter indeed needed to take a moment to step back and take heed, lest he fall. Then we read in verses 32 through 42 of Mark chapter 14 that even after Jesus had told him what was about to happen and he denied that, he refused that, the Bible tells us that they went to Gethsemane where Jesus would pray. And he called upon Peter and the other disciples, and Peter wasn't alone once again, but Peter was perhaps the most outspoken. And Jesus said, Stay here and watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. And Jesus went a little further and prayed. He did this 3 times, and every time he came back, he found that Peter and the other disciples were asleep. Now there are, I suppose, any number of ways that you could consider this. What it was that led to them being asleep. They were obviously tired. But it may be the case that they were bored. They didn't totally understand the situation at hand. They didn't understand what was taking place. Even after Jesus told them, watch, which means have your eyes open. Be prepared. Be alert. Be on guard. And then he gives them a command, pray, right? Obviously they did neither. You can't pray while you're asleep. They didn't have their eyes open. They were susceptible to temptation, weren't they? They were susceptible to evil. They were susceptible to the devil's darts because they weren't prepared. They didn't have their eyes open. They weren't alert. They weren't guarded. And they didn't have their mind in the right place. They weren't praying. And though Jesus had said, tonight I'm going to be given into the hands of evil men, they just didn't get it, did they? They didn't take Jesus' words to heart. You know, the Bible tells us that we can hear things but not really get it. How many times people have heard things over and over and over again, but then they act like they've never heard it before. And then some of those same individuals say, I'm tired of hearing that sermon or a sermon like that, or I'm tired of hearing about that subject. We need to move on. And it's that subject that they need to hear the most. Peter and the other disciples lacked a diligent preparation. They lacked a diligent appreciation for what was about to take place. They let their guard down at a moment that their guard needed to be as high as possible. And the same thing obviously can happen to us. Letting our guard down, not being awake and alert, can lead us, like it led Peter, to deny the Christ. More often than not, individuals do not fall away overnight or very quickly. It's a gradual process. And if individuals are asleep, figuratively, and don't have their eyes opened to what is taking place around them, they can simply drift away and not really realize it's going on, not really realize what's taking place. Thinking that everything is just fine or everything is exactly as it was, but slowly drifting away, not realizing that they're falling away from God, on their way to denying Christ. In Hebrews chapter 2, the Hebrews writer says, for that reason we ought or must give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. And I love that word slip because it has to do with the idea of a boat tied or moored to a dock, and that rope coming unloose, and slowly but surely that boat begins to drift away as the water and the current and the waves take it away from the dock. We're to be connected to the vine, the Christ, John chapter 15. But if we allow ourselves, we can slowly drift away. And it doesn't happen all at once. It can be a slow, gradual drift, a slipping away, if you will. And if we slip away from the life-giving nutrients of the vine, then eventually we'll die. We'll eventually get to a point where we can deny the Christ. When we find pride in ourselves and then fail to be diligent and prepared and alert, it leads to another step, doesn't it? That step we read in verse 54 of Mark chapter 14. As Jesus is being led away to his ultimate death, as he had already told Peter and his disciples this would take place. The Bible finds Peter not outspoken or boisterous anymore, does it? It says Peter was afar off. Verse 54. Peter was afar off. He talked a big game, didn't he? But when the game started, where was he? He stayed afar off, didn't he? Even into the palace of the high priest, and notice what he does. I've always found this interesting. He sat down with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. You know why? That was the most comfortable place to be, wasn't it? It wasn't the best place to be. In fact, it was not a good place to be. With the servants of the individuals who were going to put the Lord to death, you're going to sit with them. You're going to sit with them. I know that's the most comfortable place. Why? They had the majority of people there, didn't they? When you're in the majority, you don't have to worry about being persecuted. You don't have to defend yourself. You can just sit there and be quiet, and you can hide with everybody else. That's what he was doing, wasn't he? He was hiding. He was hiding. And he sat in the group with everybody else. And people do that today. They try to find a large group of people, and they get in and they intermingle and they hide so that they're not seen. They don't have to give an account. They don't have to give an account for what they say or do. They just go along with the crowd. And as long as the crowd is the majority, they don't have to find themselves standing or taking a defense or anything. And here, before Peter denied the Christ, we find him in a position of cowardly, don't we? Sitting with the servants of those individuals who would put the Lord to death. Warming himself by the fire like nothing was wrong. But how many people today do that? They try to find the most comfortable place, even though comfortable is not what we're supposed to be looking for, is it? We're supposed to be looking for truth. We're supposed to be looking for the right. We're supposed to be standing with Jesus. He wasn't standing with Jesus this night, was he? His cowardice was another step towards denying Jesus. When he was among the other disciples, he was probably looked up to. But now, being one of the disciples who walked with Jesus was not very popular, was it? This was a night when being with Jesus was not a very good thing in the eyes of the world. So Peter stayed away. He had already showed that he did not take heed lest he could fall. His pride took a hold of him. He already showed us that he was not diligent. He wasn't praying as he ought. He didn't have his eyes open. He wasn't alert to the things going on around him. And now, he's ashamed to be with Jesus. Paul said in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God that leads men to salvation. Now, it's one thing to say that, but one thing to live it, isn't it? Peter knew the Word of God. Peter loved Jesus. But he had let himself get into a position where he was not willing to stand with Jesus, where he was ashamed. People today are ashamed to carry a Bible in public. Some people are ashamed to give thanks for their food in public. Now, we ought not do things just to be seen of men, obviously. That's a sin. But we ought not be ashamed to be a Christian. We ought to use those opportunities to teach others. It may be the case that there are people who are ashamed to be with other Christians. Right? They'd rather sit with the servants of sin by the fire because it's more comfortable. Because they don't have to give a defense. They don't have to stand for anything. They can be with the majority. They'd rather sit with those servants of sin than to be with other Christians. Jesus makes clear what he thinks of cowardice. In Revelation 21 verse 8 he says, the cowardly will not enter into heaven. we can be assured if we are ashamed of Jesus and we stand afar off and we sit with the servants of sin, that we are only one step away from denying Him. It has been said that those individuals who attempt to connect both Christianity and the world are those who try to get as close to the fire as possible without getting burnt. Peter found himself close to the fire this night, didn't he? And he was not going to get away unscathed. His willingness to get farther away from Jesus and closer to the world led him to getting burnt, didn't it? And the same can affect us. The more we contact with that fire, the more the fire itself may not burn, but the consequences will affect us either now or later. When we become friends with the world, we become enmity with God, don't we? And then in verses 66 through verse 71, we read of the denial. But the denial doesn't just take place, does it? All these things led up to Peter denying Jesus, didn't it? It started with an arrogant boast. It won't be me. I will never deny the Lord, even if it means my death. Not. Then that led him to this closed eye, unprepared, unaware, non-praying, sleeping Peter, not recognizing what was going on around him while he was being led away towards denying Jesus. The next step being cowardice, wanting to be a part of the majority rather than being in the minority to stand with Jesus. And then we see his denial, don't we? Then we see his denial. Now Peter stands away from Christ. He's comforted by the fire. He's comforted by the popular large amount of crowd that he's in. And then what does he find himself doing? He finds himself doing what the world does. Didn't he? My dad always used to say, if you run with the dogs, you'll smell like them. And there are many lessons you can learn from that. That's an old Carter County saying from up in the hills, right? But if you want to be like the world, hang out with the world. Right? The more you want to be like someone, you be like them, you be with them. If you want to be like Jesus, you have to spend your time with Jesus. Right? You can't spend your time with the world and think you're going to be more Christ-like. So what did Peter do? Peter started to slip away from Jesus and more towards the world. And then what did he do? He did what the world would do. He said, I don't know that man. He went from saying, I will never deny you, and I will die before I deny you, to saying, I'm with them. I don't know this man. In so doing, he put himself in very grave danger, didn't he? Separated from God. I mean, there's no other way to look at that, is there? He separated himself from Christ. The wages of sin is death, spiritually speaking. Separate iniquity, sin, separate us from God, place us in a position of being lost. Isaiah 59, verse 1 and 2. One step at a time, Peter found himself getting further and further away from Jesus, to the point where he denied Jesus. You know, we may never actually say the words, I don't know Jesus. Right? But you can deny Jesus without saying it. You can deny the Lord in how you act. You can deny the Lord in who you place your associations with. You can deny the Lord in who you uplift and uphold and support. You may never actually say the words that Peter said. But because of these same actions, arrogance, not prepared, not diligent in keeping awake and alert, preparing or being cowardly, not wanting to be seen as a Christian, but wanting to be just a part of the rest of the group, the majority. The closer and closer you get to the world and the fire rather than closer to Jesus, the closer you are to doing things that the world would have you to do than what God would have you to do. We are called to worship God in spirit and in truth. But many today worship God how they want to worship God. We are called today to assemble together upon the first day of the week. Yet many people come up with excuses as to why they can't come. We are called to serve God, but render little to no service. We are called to stand by the Christ and to suffer for His name's sake if need be. But maybe we stand afar off in the midst of the crowd, saying nothing. You don't have to say the words of denying Christ to deny Christ. But if you're not defending the Lord, whose side are you on? Whose side are you on? Now, fortunately, the Bible tells us that Peter recognized what he had done. He repented. He became a stronger individual, didn't he? And we're going to look at that this afternoon from his own mouth, inspired of God. How he didn't allow this to keep him from being right with God, even though he slipped. And this is a lesson for those who might think that once you're saved, you're always saved. Here's Peter, a man who would be an apostle of Jesus Christ. He slowly, gradually fell from Jesus and joined the world, didn't he? For at least a moment. But because of his love for the Christ and his desire to admit his wrongdoing, he changed his life. We'll talk about that this afternoon in his own words from the epistles that he wrote. But these are lessons for us, aren't they? As Christians, to make sure that we don't slowly slip towards denying Jesus like Peter did. And this morning, if you've not yet obeyed the gospel, don't continue to be with the world. Come out of the world. Acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Believe it. Repent of your past sins. Confess the deity of the Christ. Be immersed in water to have your past sins washed away. Allow God to add you to His church. And once added to that body of Christ, let us stay alert and awake. Humble. Acknowledging our need for the Scriptures and our need for one another to stay faithful. And always look to God rather than the world. And if we'll be faithful to the end, the Bible tells us when Jesus comes that we'll have a home waiting for us there in heaven, where we can be with Him and the Godhead in eternity, and all those who have been saved before and after. And that is our goal. If you've already obeyed those initial acts but have allowed something to slowly, gradually slip you away from Christ, like Peter was, stop that process. Ask God to forgive you. If it's of a public nature, allow us to help you if we can as we stand and sing.